we're talking about history, that's, as it were, the big picture. Where do we come from? Far past. What's the history of our nation, of our family and ancestors? What's the far future? Now, nobody knows the future except God. And it makes a great deal of difference whether history has a purpose and whether our lives have a purpose. I think many people in the West have now given up on God. And so they're trying to invent meaning out of their own minds or through relationships to people who can give them meaning. And it's incredibly frustrating. I think it's incredibly frustrating because they're disconnected from God who made them, and he made them for fellowship with himself. And that fellowship is restored, as a Christian who reads the Bible knows, it's restored only through Jesus Christ.
Dr. Vern Poy-thress, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
What do we need in order to study history?
It's a big question. Well, we need God. We need God in all our lives. But if you try to break it up beyond that, we need some direction. We need a framework. We need norms for understanding how to sift what we're seeing. And those norms come primarily from God's word, from the Bible. Then we need something we're going to study. We need a world out there which is providentially controlled by God. And that's part of the issue in studying history. What are we studying? Are we studying sound and fury signifying nothing, as one of the Shakespeare characters says? Or is it something that has meaning, first of all, in the mind of God and the plan of God, and then the meanings of particular people who are made in the image of God, who are of eternal weight in a certain respect, because we're never going to just pop out of existence. So what is this world out there? And the third thing we need is ourselves. We need the capability of thinking and understanding and observing the world. And most of the time we take that for granted, but all of that is a gift of God. And when it's taken away, when people grow senile, or when babies are born with deficiencies mentally, then one of the lessons to learn is we can't take it for granted. It is a gift of God. It's a good gift. And but also contaminated by sin, so that people can call evil good and good evil. That actually is pretty much a quote from early chapters of Isaiah.
Yeah.
That people we all have an innate sense of moral good and evil, and that is from God too, conscience, but it's corrupted by sin. So when we're trying to understand the significance of actions in history, we bring ourselves to the picture inevitably. And there are other kinds of influences too. Some people have greater gifts from God to do, what should I say, kind of transporting themselves into the shoes of other people, of imagining what it would like to be Napoleon, for example.
Right.
Or what it would be like to be Hitler. I mean, that is horrific for many people, but actually there's a good biography of Hitler that made me understand some of the horror, and I think benefited me by seeing this man was not just a crazy man, but there was a rationale. It was an evil rationale, but getting inside other people is a gift that some people have more than others. So all those things, there's three things, right? You've got norms from God, you've got a world that God made, and you've got yourself made in the image of God. And because we're made in the image of God, we're capable of understanding something of the significance of what God is doing and what other people made in the image of God are doing. but we're finite. So, all those things come together, and they think there's some people, when they approach history, it's almost as if they believe themselves to be infinite, that whatever they think is right, right? And so there's not enough checks in terms of interrogating other possibilities and listening to other voices.
And that's what makes the Bible so unique, is that it's still so relevant. You compare it across so many different other manuscripts that are out there, and the fact that it's still relevant today, thousands of years later, is incredible. When you have a biblical view of history, how should we be living differently? Like when you have that perfect understanding. You've been studying it for decades. You've been probably 3 times my lifetime been studying this topic. But like when you have that view, how should you be living your life differently?
Right. Well, my view isn't perfect, right? We're all works in progress
Amen.
in the history that God writes. But I do think it makes an enormous amount of difference. And when we're talking about history, that's, as it were, the big picture. Where do we come from? Far past. What's the history of our nation, of our family and ancestors? What's the far future? Now, nobody knows the future except God. And it makes a great deal of difference whether history has a purpose and whether our lives have a purpose. I think many people in the West have now given up on God. And so they're trying to invent meaning out of their own minds or through relationships to people who can give them meaning. And it's incredibly frustrating. I think it's incredibly frustrating because they're disconnected from God who made them, and he made them for fellowship with himself. And that fellowship is restored, as a Christian who reads the Bible knows, it's restored only through Jesus Christ. But that concept is basically the concept of God ruling all of history from beginning to end for his own purposes. But then the micro picture is he's in my life. And that seems to me connects vitally the big picture and the small picture. So when we read, let's say, about Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. And that happened something like 650 years, 650 BC. Is what relevance does that have to me? But God is just as much involved in the life of Josiah, even as an 8-year-old child, as he is in my life. And so it's a continual reminder. The Bible's big picture is also a reminder of the small picture. And I think, again, our whole Western culture is struggling with the loss of the sense that God is present in my life, not simply as a psychological reality. The people who think of Christianity as kind of psychological crutch. Well, I do think it helps people to think and feel well, but that's not the point of it. The point of it is it's true, right? And that our fellowship with God is restored. And so in the light of that, you find that your life has meaning. You find that you can work with effort to serve God and not just your employer or not just your spouse. Your work has, and not just, I'm saying work for money, but whatever activities we engage in, they should be done for the glory of God. That's 1 Corinthians 10:31. So what I'm trying to paint is the relation between the big picture, God is in charge of all of history, and the small picture of my life, of your life, that they go together. If you learn the lesson from the one, you should learn the lesson that God is intimately involved in your life. Every morning I get up, I put on socks. And it is God who is determined before the foundation of the world that I'm going to put on socks. Now, I have a decision to make too, but that is not independent of the fact that God has a plan for my life. And that is the most stupendous thing, if people could only get a hold of it. But as I say, we're living in a culture where that is the understanding of that and the consciousness that God is in fact present sort of evaporating. And so I think that's, one of the deep ills that we're suffering.
Yeah.
And it all goes back to the fact we come into the world, each one of us, intrinsically alienated from God, intrinsically turned into the self. The self is the final reference point. It's my final idol, right? It's what I serve and everything I do. And actually, the people who think they're Christians can do the same thing. God becomes somebody to manipulate to get what they want. Well, that's the opposite of what it should be, right? It should be you saying, God, what do you want? But what God wants is that we be happy in him, that we would be fulfilled in him. It's not two contradictory things, but you start at the wrong end of it. And history is, all about people starting at the wrong end and getting bitten and even killed because they're they're out for themselves. And so they can't get happiness. You think of the drug user, right? If a user of illegal drugs is getting high, you can understand, well, he wants to be happy. The drug gives him a happiness high, but he's killing himself.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that's a picture of all of us. We're all innately turned inward like that, and innately not good judges of what's really good for us. That's why we have to be reconciled to God.
Yeah. One thing I know to be true is my heart is deceitful, right? I can think my intentions are pure, even with this own podcast. I'm like, the reason I started this podcast was like, I want to have conversations with other believers in all walks of life and have meaningful conversation that would be edifying to one another, and then edifying to the people listening. But even in that, I know my heart is deceitful and like, oh, well, maybe I'm really wanting to build some sort of legacy, or maybe I'm trying to get some sort of status. And so I'm always aware of my heart being deceitful. So that's why I have to have a clear conscience of like, okay, Lord, like, listen, I'm laying this before you. I know my tendency is to always glorify myself. So how can I die to myself and give more to you?
Yes, and I believe it's an intrinsic aspect of knowing Jesus Christ personally. It is the one thing that enables us to look with realism at our own sin. Otherwise, it's too hard to bear. But because Jesus brings forgiveness, there's forgiveness, then it becomes bearable to admit, yeah, I have this self-centeredness. I have these sins.
One of the quotes in your book, you say, to think that we are in every way better people than in the past is a sign of arrogance. What do you mean by that?
Yes, well, I'm thinking of a modern tendency, and I'm not the first. I think C.S. Lewis and a number of other people have observed that people in the 19th and 20th centuries are so enamored with scientific and technological progress. And technological progress has just exploded since about 1950, and just we're inundated with, new gadgets. So we're so superior to the past. Well, we're superior in the number of gadgets, but that doesn't make us morally superior. That doesn't make us religiously superior. And if we face it, human nature has not changed. I think there have been more human lives lost in the wars in the 20th century than all the wars before. And so it's really disgraceful. But the trouble is, if you have these gadgets, one of the lines of technological work that you can do is to invent new weapons, right? So that warfare has become, in some respects, more horrible in the 20th century and into the 21st. Now, we're not free from wars in some parts of the world even now, and we're not going to be, because those tendencies go back to the human heart. And that's another thing about the Bible, of its moral and religious realism. It doesn't sugarcoat things, and it's surprising that some of the Bible heroes, like Abraham and David, you see accounts of their sins, That's not what anybody does if they're going to make a hero, right? You make a hero who is a pure hero.
Right.
But these are not. Why not? Because they're showing that even people who have been reconciled to God, and Abraham, David among them, they still have indwelling sin. They still have the remnants of the old life, and that never totally disappears. That's the teaching of the Bible. So that's realism, and it goes a long way to explain the tragedies of the Christian past, right? And people, I think in the modern world, they're ready to say, oh, Christianity is passé, because look at all the, for some people, it's the scandal of moral mistakes made by people who claim to be Christian. Now, some of them weren't really Christian, but that's a mixed bag. And if we had time, we could get into the fact that history is a very mixed bag in terms of what Christians have done to influence the world, because there are people who claim to be Christian who are perfectly nasty and who got into leadership positions. But there are also people like Florence Nightingale, who started up hospitals. She's one of the innovators in the work of building hospitals, and William Wilberforce, who is instrumental in stopping the slave trade. So there were innate impulses in Christianity, I believe, for righteousness, but they're very mixed because the Christians are imperfect. That's another thing to do, in looking about extra biblical history. Extra biblical history is like biblical history in that respect. The Bible is full of these mixed cases, puzzling cases, and failures on the part of righteous people, and repentance sometimes on the part of very evil people, Ahab and Manasseh, evil kings. They both repented. So there's hope for any of us. It was one of the messages out of there.
Yeah. How does reading history in the Bible then lead us to praise and glorify God? Right? It sounds like an obvious question, but I really want you to kind of unpack that.
Right. Well, the Bible's history is not merely to entertain us, not merely to give us facts. The individual stories are part of the grand story of redemption. And it's that grand story which is the center for praise and realizing the immensity of God's goodness, the immensity of his mercy. So when we talk about glorifying God, ascribing to God the goodness and the magnificence of who he really is. Now that comes out in many respects in the Bible, but one of them is in the historical accounts, because they sometimes show the magnitude of his mercy. When David is caught in adultery and setting up Uriah's murder, that's a terrible event to record in the Bible, but it ends in God's mercy. And so it's a hopeful event for everybody. So it's that kind of thing. But then the Bible is special because all the events are oriented around the story of redemption that culminates and climaxes in the work of Christ and his life and death and resurrection. So we see many precursors to that in the Old Testament. David is one of them. David is a king. He's basically a good king. And as such, he's a kind of picture beforehand of the final king, the Messianic king, of Jesus himself. But his imperfections remind us, no, this is not the real thing. This is only a shadow of the real thing.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of thing. But then you can look out from the Bible in all its specialness and say, God is still acting to save people, sometimes to save them physically. Sometimes he has mercy on non-Christians. Somebody is trapped in a well or in a burning house, let's say, and they just cry out to God. And God rescues them. Well, that may be the beginning of their pursuing a relationship with God, or it may not. They may just toss it aside. But that shows God's mercy. But the biggest mercy, of course, is when he brings people to a knowledge of Jesus Christ. So one of the things I like about the history outside the Bible is watching the fulfillment of something God has predicted in the Bible, namely the spread of the message of salvation and the spread of people who follow Jesus all across the world. And it's happening, even though in the midst of persecution, in the midst of sometimes intense opposition from political and religious sources, people are hearing the message and believing. And it's going out into more and more language groups and more cultures. So I think that's an enormously exciting thing. My wife, for her doctoral work, studied the Reformation. And that's an exciting period because there was a rediscovery of this message, the message of salvation in the Bible, in its purity. And you see people being transformed and cultures being transformed, whole cities and towns being transformed. Not everyone, right? It's always this mix.
Yeah.
But it's a very exciting period. And you can see, well, this is God at work, not because there's some kind of special hand in the sky, but because the Bible describes this is part of the spread of the gospel. We know that God is in it.
On page 34, you should see how many highlights I have of your book. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was I always get this question asked by a bunch of different friends of this, like, okay, if there's such a loving God, right? Like, how can bad things happen to us? You mentioned, like, there are other instances in the Bible that confirm the general principle that God controls evil events for his own good purposes. So in light of that, how should we view God when, right, quote unquote, bad things happen to us?
Yes. Well, it's a great question. And having read my book, part of the answer I would give, part is that there's much we do not know.
Yeah.
There's much that is mysterious. Where I like to start is with the crucifixion of Christ. You talk about bad events. This is intensely evil event, right? Corrupt people putting an innocent man to death with enormous suffering and shame. But God works the salvation of the world. And I think sometimes God does not explain himself in a lot of the other horrific events that take place because he wants us to focus on that one place where he shows both his goodness and his rule over intense evil. It's a profound thing. If you want something earlier than that, the story of Job is a good place for people to begin because Job is innocent and yet he suffers. And even to the end of the book, he never is given a straight answer. Why am I suffering? Instead, he has an encounter with God that assures him of God's surpassing greatness and ends up saying, who am I, in effect? I don't know your ways. I don't know why, but I'm willing to submit to the fact that you are God and I'm not. That's obviously not exactly what Job says, but I think that's an experience that people can go through themselves, not obviously every aspect of it. But if suffering comes into our lives, then it can serve the good of God, though we don't see it at the time. There's a passage in Romans 5 where it says, suffering brings endurance, and endurance brings character, and character brings hope. God uses these things. It's not easy at the time. And there are people like Johnny Erickson who have suffered greatly and written about it in a way that I think reaches other people more than I can. I can't say that I've had a great deal of suffering in my life, but I understand the fact that a certain amount of suffering is going to happen to everybody. It just is. And one of the things about when it happens is sometimes it's actually because you've done something wrong. Suffering can be a punishment for individual sin. And we need to face that. It's very unpopular to say it, but you got to ask. Anybody's got to ask when suffering comes, is God drawing attention to something where I've sinned?
Hmm.
Either it's a direct consequence of my sin that I'm now in the fix, right? If I've been a spendthrift, right, and then I lose my job and I have no resources to fall back in, well, maybe I would better repent and manage my money better. That's just a, small example. But people ought not to get hung up on that either, because Job and other cases too are examples. Not all suffering is a direct consequence of personal individual sin. So, there's no need to kind of dig if God doesn't bring some sin to our attention. But it's a time also, I think, to reflect on the fact that this world is not an ideal world.
Hmm.
All suffering is a kind of reminder that we're headed to a new heaven and new earth. And until we get there, we ought to long for it and not be satisfied with what we have now. So I think particularly, I guess, in the prosperous societies of America and Western Europe, the people get addicted to the world and feel it's their right to be, to have plenty and to be in good health and so on. And really all those things are blessings from God. But if they're taken away, then we're resentful. But what ought to happen is saying, I need to refocus because I've been investing hopes in my happiness that I should be investing in God and my relation to him. So that's another kind of thing that can happen. There are many dynamics. I mean, God works in each person's life a little bit different because he knows us. He's the only one who knows us to the very bottom. But I think when people go through suffering, it's nice to latch on to a mature Christian. Not every Christian gives good advice. The mature Christians can stand alongside a person and pray for him and empathize what he's going through, but also remind him of the promises of God, remind him of the hope that I've laid out of the new heaven and the new earth. And pastors, right, are one of the reasons why God raises them up is to do this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think people ought to realize they don't have to go through all of this alone. Mm-hmm. Of course, God is the primary person, right? But also he appoints other people if they're part of a Christian community. And these people are real help. I think many people out there have never had the experience of being part of a robust, healthy Christian community. My wife and I have, and it's incredibly helpful. It's incredibly blessing. Yeah. And I'm just sorry that, people have met so many dysfunctional or even fake Christian communities, right? Right. Well, I have the name of Christian, but not the reality. And it doesn't mean that there's going to be any group on earth that's going to be flawlessly perfect. But that's one of the resources in suffering as well.
Yeah, I think about it in my own church. I recently just moved churches. Was part of a very charismatic church for about 15 years of my life. In the last 5 or 6, hopped on a couple of different churches, and then finally came to this one church where I feel like it's actually healthy. It's cool. I get to see a group of guys on a Thursday night for 3 hours. It's not a quick 45-minute Bible study, but it's hey, how are you really doing, Luke? What is going on? What is that sin that we talked about last week? How are you doing with that? What's going on? And I'm living life with them. I'm not just seeing them on a Sunday for an hour and then, oh, hey, see you next week. It's, hey, man, I'm going to see you on Tuesday. Hey, I'm going to see you on Thursday. And I'm going to walk with you, and I'm not going to condemn you, but I'm going to call you out when you try to hide behind your sin, right? When there's vulnerability, you start sharing it all. And then the week goes on and maybe you fall into sin again. And then you're oh, shoot, I know he's going to bring it up, but that's what we need, and then you have those brothers who are solid, those mature Christians, right? Who can reemphasize and remind you of the gospel, remind you of truth, because so quickly we can get so down on ourselves and forget the free gift that we have from God. If our salvation was dependent upon us, we'd be so hopeless, so hopeless. And I'm glad that it's not. And there's actually a book called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness by Timothy Keller. And he has this line in here that goes, we get the verdict before the performance, right? And every other religion, It's you get performance. The atheists, Muslim, Buddhist, right? It's they're doing all these things, these quote unquote good things, and hopefully by the end of it, they'll get a verdict that says, "Yep, you're good." But in Christianity, we get the verdict before the performance. So Jesus has already been in the courtroom. And then based upon that, we can do quote unquote good things. We can have performance, not because we're trying to affect our salvation, but because of the result of the verdict that's already in. And it's like, once that finally clicked in my mind, I was like, oh, it's so freeing. There's no more condemnation anymore.
Yes, great. Yeah. And we see lives of people in the Bible that illustrate that very thing. Again, not perfectly, but the realism helps to assure us, no, you don't have to be a perfect Christian to be a genuine Christian.
Yeah. And in light of all this, with history, with all these different elements, what is the main thing you want the people who are going to read your book to walk away from it? What's the core element?
Right. I think it would be to understand God is providentially there. His hand is in all events, small and big. Get the big picture, right? Where we came from, how we went astray, Adam, Eve, and fall, what Christ has done, where we're going. Get that big picture, but then fit the details even of your own life into that. Your own personal history is part of this grand plan of God. And everything that happens for a purpose, though many times we cannot discern it, right? That's part of the little lesson of Job that we've talked about. And I believe that understanding the greatness and presence of God affects not only our understanding of the big picture of history, but the small picture of each individual life.
Dr. Vern Poy-thress, ladies and gentlemen, if people want to follow your work, where should we send them?
Well, there's a website, a frame, and then a hyphen, Poythress.org.
Awesome.
And that has the main things about me and my friend, John Frame.
Awesome. I'll have all the links in the description. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
What's happening, people? Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And consider subscribing. Peace.